It was just another long, quiet evening drive home after a shift at the local bait shop. I'd been stocking shelves all day with new lures, sorting through tangles of old fishing lines, and half listening to the regulars spin their usual tales about the one that got away. Not exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills, and it let me spend my days surrounded by fishing gear, which was about as close to being on the water as I could get most weekdays. As I cruised down the old Riverside Road, my truck rattling along the cracked pavement, I caught sight of something strange, a new shop I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked between a couple of boarded-up storefronts, the kind of place you could drive past 100 times and never see unless you were looking for it. The sign above the small, weathered door was simple, but it stood out. Hooks, it read, in big, bold letters, with a smaller tagline underneath, "Fish in their waters." It seemed odd, almost cryptic. What did that even mean? Fish in their waters? I squinted, trying to get a better look as I slowed down, my curiosity getting the best of me. My old sneakers, worn thin from years of use, seemed to almost beg me to stop. The soles were barely holding together, and my gear was starting to show its age, too. Maybe it was time for an upgrade. Besides, I had never been one to pass up a good fishing shop. I pulled the truck over, its tired engine giving a soft grumble as I parked just outside the shop. The building looked ancient, its wooden siding weathered and gray, with vines creeping up one side. A little bell jingled as I pushed open the door, stepping inside. The smell hit me first, musty, like old leather mixed with the scent of fresh water, almost like stepping onto a dock first thing in the morning. It was oddly comforting. The inside of the store wasn't much bigger than my living room, but it was packed with shelves. There were fishing rods of every shape and size leaning against the walls, tackle boxes stacked high, and rows of nets hanging from the ceiling like cobwebs. Glass jars of bait, hooks, and shiny lures were scattered across old wooden tables. Some of the gear looked brand new, while other items seemed ancient, like they had stories to tell if you asked them the right way. Behind the counter sat an old man, his head down as he meticulously tied a knot in a thick fishing line. His hair was silver, thinning on top, but he had the kind of weather-beaten face that told me he'd spent a lifetime out on the water. He looked like the kind of guy who'd forgotten more about fishing than most people ever learned. When he noticed me standing there, he perked up, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Evenin'," he greeted, his voice rough, like gravel scraping together. "Looking for something special, or just browsing?" I hesitated for a second, glancing around at the shelves. I hadn't really planned on buying anything, but something about the place had drawn me in. I felt like I was meant to be here, even though I couldn't explain why. "Just browsing," I replied, still scanning the aisles. "Figured I'd check it out." "Take your time," he said with a slight nod, his attention drifting back to the knot he was tying. "Let me know if you need anything." I wandered deeper into the store, my fingers trailing over the rods as I passed them. There was an odd assortment of gear here, some of it old, well-used, with chipped handles and faded paint, while other items looked like they had just been pulled off the assembly line. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find in our small town, where people usually just bought their gear from the big box stores. This felt different. It felt personal. One rod, in particular, caught my eye. It was propped up against the back wall, a dark, polished wood with a sleek, shiny reel that glinted in the dim light of the store. There was something about it that drew me in. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew right away that this rod had a story. It looked old, but not in a bad way. More like it had seen its fair share of battles and come out the other side still standing. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, solid, like it had been made to last through generations. The craftsmanship was unlike anything I'd seen before, and as I ran my fingers along the reel, I noticed the engravings, tiny, intricate patterns that I couldn't quite make out. "Nice choice," came the old man's voice from behind the counter. I looked up, surprised to see him watching me. He gave a small smile. "That one's been through a lot of waters." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was pulling my leg or if he actually meant it. "How much?" I asked, still admiring the rod. "For you?" $40, he said with a wink, as if he knew something I didn't. It seemed like a steal for a rod like this, so I didn't argue. I fished a couple of crumpled bills from my wallet and handed them over. The old man rang it up on an ancient cash register that clicked and clacked with every key press. As he packed the rod up in a simple cloth case, he looked at me with a strange glint in his eye. "Enjoy your time in their waters," he said, his voice low and deliberate. I furrowed my brow at his choice of words. "Their waters?" I repeated, confused. But before I could ask him what he meant, he waved me off with a knowing smile, turning his attention back to the knot he'd been working on when I came in. I walked out of the shop, still feeling that strange, unsettled curiosity gnawing at the back of my mind. The rod felt good in my hands, but something about the whole experience made me uneasy. As I got back into my truck and drove home, the old man's words echoed in my head. Enjoy their waters. Who exactly was he talking about? The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window and sunlight creeping through the blinds. It was the perfect day for fishing, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and just enough warmth in the air to make the lake feel inviting. I glanced at the rod leaning against the corner of my room, the one I picked up from that odd little shop. Something about it still stuck with me. The old man's strange words, the weight of the rod, the sense that it was more than just a piece of fishing equipment. I couldn't shake it. I decided today was the day to break it in. Maybe I'd just been overthinking it, and once I spent some time on the water, everything would feel normal again. I packed a small cooler with sandwiches, a couple of beers, and my usual fishing gear. As I loaded my truck, I noticed the new rod sitting next to my old one. The difference was stark. My usual rod looked battered and faded next to the new one, and for some reason, I didn't feel the same connection to it anymore. I reached for the new rod instead. There's a small, quiet lake I like to visit about an hour outside of town. It's tucked away from the main roads, surrounded by trees, with hardly anyone else around. Most folks preferred the bigger lakes nearby for fishing, but this one always felt like my own personal spot. Just me, the water, and the fish. I figured it'd be the perfect place to try out the new rod, no distractions, no interruptions. The drive was peaceful. I kept thinking about the shop as the miles rolled by, the way the old man had smiled when I left, like he knew something I didn't. Enjoy their waters. It echoed in my head again. I shook it off. Maybe it was just some local saying I hadn't heard before, nothing more. By the time I pulled up to the lake, the sun was high in the sky, reflecting off the calm water like glass. I grabbed my cooler and tackle box, threw the rod over my shoulder, and made my way to the shoreline. The spot was perfect, quiet, serene, and not a soul in sight. Just the way I liked it. As I stood at the edge of the lake, I felt an odd sense of anticipation. It wasn't the usual excitement I felt before casting my line. It was deeper, more intense, like the lake itself was waiting for something. I shook off the weird feeling and rigged up the new rod, sliding a lure onto the line and casting it into the water with a smooth flick of my wrist. The rod felt amazing, the kind of precision you dream of when you're out fishing. The line sliced through the air and hit the water with a soft splash. For a few minutes, everything was normal. The sun was warm on my face, the breeze was light, and the sound of the lake lapping against the shore was calming. I reeled in slowly, letting the lure dance through the water, waiting for that familiar tug of a bite. But then, something changed. It started with the faintest tremor in the line, something I'd barely even call a nibble. I gave the reel a small tug, hoping to entice whatever was down there, but instead of the usual resistance of a fish on the line, I felt a sudden, powerful pull. It wasn't like any fish I'd ever hooked. It felt wrong. Like the water itself had latched onto my lure and was trying to drag me in. The rod bent sharply, the line stretching tight as the pull became stronger. I gripped the handle tighter, trying to reel it in, but the force was too much. It wasn't like fighting a fish, it was like fighting the current of a raging river. My heart pounded as I braced my feet against the shore, my boots digging into the mud. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the lake wanted me, like it was trying to pull me under. My breath quickened as I yanked harder on the rod, trying to break whatever had latched onto the line. But the harder I pulled, the stronger it became. The water, once calm and peaceful, now seemed darker, more menacing. Ripples spread out from where the line disappeared into the depths, as if something huge was moving beneath the surface. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went black. I don't remember falling. I don't remember letting go of the rod or stumbling back. I was just gone. 1 second I was standing on the shore, fighting the rod, and the next, there was nothing but darkness. It wasn't like closing my eyes, it was a complete void, like I'd been swallowed by the earth. My head spun, and I felt a strange sense of weightlessness. My feet no longer touched the ground, and the sounds of the world, the birds, the wind, the rustling of the trees, were all gone. There was only silence. And then, slowly, light began to creep back in. When my vision cleared, I realized I wasn't at the lake anymore. I was standing on a different shore, one I didn't recognize. The sky above me was a deep, bruised orange, the kind of sunset that feels almost unnatural, casting long shadows across the dark, restless waters in front of me. The air was cold, biting at my skin, and the smell of salt water filled my nose. The rod was still in my hands, but my surroundings had completely changed. Panic began to well up in my chest. I looked down at my feet, expecting to see my worn-out boots, but instead, I was wearing something else, heavy, old leather boots, cracked and covered in dried mud. They weren't mine. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, like I wasn't fully in control. It was as if I was in someone else's skin, my movements foreign and unnatural. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, a figure standing at the edge of the water, holding a net filled with fish. He looked like a fisherman, but something was wrong. The fish weren't flopping like they should be. They were thrashing violently, as if trying to escape something far worse than the net. "Help me," the man shouted, his voice filled with desperation. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only watch as the water behind him began to churn and darken, swirling like a whirlpool. The man's eyes widened in terror as he was yanked backward into the swirling abyss, disappearing beneath the surface with a final, desperate scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, I was back. The lake was still. The rod was in my hands. My boots, my own boots, were firmly planted on the shore. I dropped the rod, stumbling back in shock. My heart was racing, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. It had all felt so real, so vivid. But it couldn't have been. Could it? I looked at the rod lying on the ground, its polished wood gleaming innocently in the sunlight. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The vision, or whatever that had been, stayed with me, lingering at the edge of my thoughts like a dark cloud. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, that it was the product of exhaustion or a momentary lapse, the truth gnawed at me. I'd felt it. I'd been there, in someone else's boots, living a moment that wasn't mine to live. I couldn't go back to the lake. The new rod sat in the corner of my room, untouched since that day, and every time I glanced at it, my stomach churned. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened to me. And I knew exactly where to go. The small shop, Hooks, loomed in my mind like an unanswered question. It had to be connected somehow. The old man, with his cryptic words and that strange knowing look, had seemed almost expectant. Like he knew what was coming. Like he had seen it all before. So, on the third day, I drove back. The afternoon sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows as I parked outside the shop. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the weathered wooden sign. "Fish in their waters," it read again, the same eerie phrase that had stuck with me since the first visit. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the familiar jingle of the bell announcing my arrival. The old man was there, sitting behind the counter, just like before. He looked up, his gray eyes locking onto mine with a knowing glint. It was as if he'd been waiting for me. Back again, are we? He said, his voice thick with amusement. How'd you like the rod? I swallowed hard, the memories of that night rushing back all at once. My mouth was dry, but I forced the words out. What happened to me? He chuckled softly, as if I'd just asked a question with an obvious answer. You used the rod, didn't you? Cast your line into the waters. His voice had that same cryptic edge to it, like he was dancing around the truth, teasing me with it. I stared at him, frustration building in my chest. What the hell was that? I wasn't here. I was somewhere else, in someone else's body. I saw something, someone. He raised a hand, cutting me off mid-sentence. Slow down, son. You're not the first one to come in here with a story like that. I blinked, stunned. What do you mean? The old man leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. These rods, they're special. They don't just catch fish. They've got a connection to other things. Other people. When you cast your line with one of these, you're casting it into waters that belong to someone else. Their memories, their experiences, their final moments. It's not always pleasant. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as his words sunk in. So, what I saw, that fisherman, was real, he finished for me, nodding. At least, it was real for him. You walked in his boots, saw what he saw before he trailed off, his eyes darkening. Well, before the water took him. I stared at the counter, my mind racing. The weight of what he was saying pressed down on me. Why would you sell something like that? He shrugged, almost nonchalantly. People come in here looking for something different. Something special. They don't always know what they're getting into. His eyes gleamed. But once they've cast their line, they always come back. I felt a sickening realization wash over me. You knew this would happen. You knew, and you sold it to me anyway. The old man's smile faded, replaced by something colder, more serious. It's not about me knowing. It's about you. You were drawn here, weren't you? Something brought you into my shop, something made you pick up that rod. You needed to see it for yourself. I clenched my fists, anger bubbling up inside me. I didn't need to see anything. I didn't ask for this. Maybe not, he said, his voice calm. But now that you've started, you're not gonna stop, are you? I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, he wasn't. As terrifying as that first experience had been, there was something deep inside me that couldn't let it go. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what these rods were, what they could show me. The old man seemed to sense my inner struggle. He reached behind the counter and pulled out another rod. This one was different from the first. It was shorter, heavier, with a thick reel that looked worn from years of use. The handle was wrapped in faded leather, and the wood was dark, almost black. This one's for you, he said, sliding it across the counter toward me. I stared at it, my hands trembling. I can't go through that again. The old man leaned forward, his voice low and serious. You already know you will. This rod's got a different story to tell. The question is, are you ready to listen? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Every part of me was screaming to walk out of that shop and never look back, to leave the rods and the strange visions behind. But I couldn't. Something deeper, stronger, pulled at me, urging me to pick it up. Slowly, I reached out and grabbed the rod. Good choice, the old man said, his voice soft but firm. This one's seen darker waters. Without another word, I handed him the cash and left the shop, the weight of the rod heavy in my hands. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the world shift around me, the air thickening like the calm before a storm. My truck sat waiting for me at the curb, but I couldn't help but glance back at the shop one last time. The old man was watching me through the window, his face shadowed by the dim light inside. He gave a small, knowing nod, as if to say good luck. I didn't know where I was headed next, but something told me the waters were about to get a whole lot deeper. That night, I couldn't sleep. The new rod leaned against the wall in my room, casting long shadows that danced across the floor in the dim light of the street lamp outside. I kept thinking about the old man's words, replaying them over and over in my head, this one seen darker waters. What did that even mean? I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out, but deep down, I knew I didn't have much of a choice. The pull was stronger now. It was like an itch that I couldn't scratch, a need gnawing at me from the inside. I had to see what this new rod was connected to, no matter how much it scared me. The first vision had shaken me to my core, but the curiosity was undeniable. I needed to know more. I needed to understand. So the next morning, without even thinking, I packed my gear and drove to the coast. There was an old fishing pier about 2 hours away where I'd gone a few times in the past. It wasn't the kind of place most people fished anymore. The water was deep, cold, and unpredictable, but that was exactly what drew me there this time. The deeper, the darker, the better. By the time I arrived, the fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, blanketing the shoreline in a cold mist. The pier stretched out into the gray ocean, its wooden planks creaking under the weight of time and disrepair. Waves crashed against the pylons, sending sprays of salt water up into the air. It was the kind of day that made you feel small, insignificant, like the ocean could swallow you whole without a second thought. I parked the truck and grabbed the new rod, the weight of it feeling more ominous in my hands than before. With every step toward the end of the pier, my heart beat a little faster. The air was damp and cold, and a sense of dread settled in my chest, but I couldn't turn back now. Something in me was committed, whether I liked it or not. I reached the end of the pier and stood there for a moment, staring out at the endless stretch of gray water. The waves were choppy, and the wind howled, but it felt right. This was where I needed to be. The deeper, the darker, the better. Without hesitating, I rigged up the line, feeling the tension of the new reel as I flicked the lure out into the water. It flew through the air, slicing through the mist before disappearing into the dark sea with a soft plop. The second it hit the water, I felt that strange pull again, not physical this time, but something deeper, something in my gut. Like the ocean itself was watching me, waiting. I stood there for what felt like hours, just watching the waves crash against the pier, the line gently tugging with the movement of the water. But then, just like before, something changed. The rod jerked hard, almost pulling me off balance. This wasn't a fish, this was something else. The force behind the pull was unnatural, too strong for anything living in these waters. My hands gripped the rod tighter, trying to reel in whatever had hooked itself, but the harder I pulled, the more the ocean fought back. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The air around me grew colder, the wind sharper, and the waves started to pound harder against the pier. The pull on the line grew stronger, more insistent, as if something beneath the surface was trying to drag me in. And then, just like before, everything went dark. The wind, the waves, the creaking of the pier, all of it vanished. I was no longer standing at the end of the pier. I wasn't even sure if I was anywhere. For a moment, there was only silence, a thick, suffocating silence that wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. When the darkness finally lifted, I found myself on a boat. The wooden deck swayed beneath my feet, the creak of the old vessel matching the rhythm of the waves. I could taste the salt in the air, feel the wind biting at my skin. The sea around me was vast and endless, stretching out in every direction, with no sign of land. Above me, the sky was a deep, angry shade of gray, thick clouds swirling as if a storm was brewing. In my hands, I was gripping the new rod, but it felt heavier now, almost like it was weighed down by something far below the surface. And I wasn't alone. A man stood next to me, his back turned as he wrestled with his own fishing line. He was drenched in seawater, his clothes clinging to his body, his face obscured by the shadows. But even from where I stood, I could feel his fear. His hands shook as he reeled in, and the tension in the air was palpable. Whatever he was fighting wasn't a fish, it was something far worse. Before I could call out to him, the rod in his hands jerked violently, pulling him forward. He let out a desperate shout, his voice swallowed by the roar of the ocean. I watched in horror as the line snapped, sending him tumbling forward, crashing hard onto the deck. His hands clawed at the slippery wood as he tried to scramble back, but it was too late. The water erupted beneath him, a massive, swirling vortex opening up like a mouth, sucking him in with terrifying speed. His screams were drowned out by the churning sea as the boat tilted, the force of the pull threatening to take me with it. I grabbed onto the side of the boat, my knuckles white with the effort to hold on. The man was gone. Just like that, swallowed by the dark, cold sea. And then, everything went still. The wind died down, the boat righted itself, and the water returned to its normal, choppy state. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, my hands trembling as I let go of the boat's edge. The rod in my hands was still there, but it felt lighter now, as if the weight of the vision had passed. I looked out at the ocean, half expecting to see the man resurface, but there was nothing. No sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. Just the endless, uncaring sea stretching out before me. Before I could process what had just happened, I blinked, and I was back on the pier. The mist still hung heavy in the air, the waves still crashed against the pylons, but the vision was over. My feet were planted firmly on the wooden planks, the new rod in my hands. But the memory of the man, his fear, his desperate struggle, was still with me, imprinted in my mind like a scar. I dropped the rod to the ground, my chest heaving with shallow breaths. The cold wind bit at my skin, but I barely noticed it. I had just watched someone die. I wanted to leave, to get in my truck and drive far away from this place, far away from that shop and its cursed rods. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. The pull was too strong. I'd be back again, no matter how much I wanted to escape. The waters had already taken hold of me. And they weren't going to let go. I didn't sleep that night. After what I saw on the pier, every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that boat, watching the man disappear into the sea's hungry maw. His screams echoed in my head, blending with the sound of the waves crashing outside my window. No matter how much I tossed and turned, I couldn't escape it. By morning, I was exhausted but restless, my mind buzzing with questions. Who was that man? Why had I seen his final moments? And most importantly, what the hell had dragged him under? I stared at the rod propped against the wall, the same rod that had pulled me into that nightmare. It stood there, innocent enough, but I knew better now. That thing was no ordinary piece of fishing gear. It was a doorway, a gateway to something darker, something that didn't belong in this world. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. The pull was still there, stronger than ever, whispering to me in the back of my mind. It didn't matter how terrifying the visions were. I needed to understand. I needed answers. So, instead of throwing the rod into the nearest dumpster like any sane person would have, I found myself driving back to Hooks. The shop had become an obsession now, its mystery gnawing at me every waking second. The old man had answers, he had too. I was tired of being kept in the dark, tired of experiencing these horrors without knowing why. By the time I pulled up outside the shop, the sky was overcast, thick clouds threatening rain. The sign above the door looked even more faded than I remembered, as if it had aged years in just a few days. Fish in their waters. Those words made my skin crawl now, but they also compelled me to step inside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, the familiar scent of leather and old wood wrapping around me. The shop looked just as it had before, but this time, there was no sense of curiosity, only dread. The old man was behind the counter, same as ever, but when he saw me, a sly smile crept onto his face, like he'd been expecting me all along. "You're back," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "How'd the second rod treat you?" I didn't answer at first, my jaw clenched tight. All I could think about was the man from the boat, his desperate face, the way the sea had swallowed him whole. "I saw someone die," I finally muttered, my voice shaky. "I watched him get pulled under. What the hell is happening to me?" The old man didn't seem surprised. In fact, he looked almost pleased, like I'd passed some kind of test. "You're seeing what they saw," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The people who owned these rods before you. Their final moments, their last cast into the waters. Why? I demanded, my frustration boiling over. Why am I seeing this? What's the point? He gave a slow, deliberate shrug, his eyes gleaming with a dark kind of knowledge. That's the way of the waters, son. These rods, they connect you to something deeper. You're not just fishing anymore, you're tapping into the memories of those who came before you. Their triumphs, their failures, and sometimes, their deaths. I shook my head, disbelief mixing with fear. This isn't normal. I didn't sign up for this. No one ever does, the old man said, his tone almost mocking. But once you cast your line into their waters, there's no going back. I stared at him, my chest tight with anger. He was speaking in riddles, never giving me the straight answer I wanted. Who are they? The people I'm seeing? Why am I being shown this? The old man's smile faded, replaced by something more serious, more dangerous. You're not just seeing their deaths, you're feeling their burdens. The weight they carried in life, the things they couldn't escape from. The waters remember them, and now you do too. I opened my mouth to argue, but something stopped me. Deep down, I knew he was right. Every time I'd cast with these rods, I hadn't just been watching, I'd been feeling. The fear, the hopelessness, the sense that there was something looming just beneath the surface, waiting to drag me down with it. But why me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper now. Why am I the one seeing this? The old man chuckled softly. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. People come in here for all sorts of reasons, looking for something special. Most of them don't know what they're really asking for, but some. He trailed off, his eyes locking onto mine. Some are drawn to it, like you. The waters call to them, and once they've cast that first line, they can't help but come back. I felt a knot form in my throat. So what happens next? I asked, my voice hoarse. I just keep seeing people die. He shook his head slowly. It's not about the dying, son. It's about the living. Each rod tells a story. Some of those stories end in death, sure, but others end in something else. Redemption, maybe. Peace. You'll have to find out for yourself. I stared down at the counter, my mind racing. The idea of redemption, of finding peace through these visions, seemed absurd. But the alternative, continuing to live with the weight of these experiences, wasn't any better. The old man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low whisper. There's one more rod for you. One last cast. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew I couldn't walk away now. As terrifying as it all was, I needed to see it through to the end. I needed to know what the final rod had in store for me. Reluctantly, I nodded. Where is it? The old man reached under the counter and pulled out a rod unlike the others. This one was sleek in silver, polished to a shine, with a handle wrapped in dark leather. It was shorter than the others, but there was something about it that made it feel heavier, like it carried a history that none of the others had. It radiated an energy I couldn't quite describe. This one's special, the old man said, sliding it across the counter. It's been through more waters than you can imagine. I hesitated, staring down at the rod. The weight of everything I'd experienced so far pressed down on me, but the pull was too strong to resist. I reached out and grabbed the handle, the cold metal sending a shiver up my spine. Where do I go this time? I asked, my voice low. The old man's smile returned, sly and secretive. You'll know when you get there. I didn't bother asking him to explain. I knew he wouldn't. Without another word, I turned and left the shop, the rod slung over my shoulder. The air outside felt heavier now, the weight of the storm clouds pressing down on me. As I got into my truck, I glanced back at the shop one last time. The old man was watching me through the window, that same knowing smile on his face. He raised a hand, almost as if to wave, but I quickly turned the key in the ignition and drove off before I could second-guess myself. I didn't know where I was headed yet, but I had a feeling the waters were about to take me somewhere I couldn't come back from. I couldn't shake the weight of the new rod as I drove away from the shop. The sleek, silver reel gleamed in the passenger seat, catching glints of the gray light that filtered through the thickening clouds. It was shorter than the other rods, but it felt heavier, like it carried more than just the promise of another fishing trip. It carried something dark, something final. I didn't know where I was headed, but I let instinct take over. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual, knuckles white. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the radio turned low enough to barely be a hum in the background. The air outside felt thick with the promise of rain, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in the further I went. After what felt like hours, the road opened up into a narrow dirt path, leading down toward a river I'd never seen before. The river snaked through a dense forest, the water flowing fast and dark, swirling in strange patterns like it was alive. It was an unsettling sight, yet I felt an undeniable pull toward it, just as I had felt with every other rod. The current roared in the distance, growing louder as I stepped out of the truck. There was no turning back now. The dirt beneath my boots was soft and damp as I made my way toward the river's edge, the sound of rushing water filling my ears. The air was heavy with moisture, thick and cold, the kind that clung to your skin and seeped into your bones. The whole place felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be touched by human hands. The trees surrounding the river bent and twisted unnaturally, their branches knotted like they were reaching for something, or someone. As I stood there, staring at the dark water, I felt that familiar, eerie sensation wash over me. The rod in my hand pulsed with a strange energy, and I knew what I had to do. Without thinking, I tied on a lure, my fingers moving with a practiced ease that felt almost mechanical now. The movements were automatic, driven by something deeper than muscle memory. I cast the line into the river with a smooth flick of the wrist. The lure hit the water with a soft plop, and for a moment, everything went still. The river, once roaring and wild, seemed to calm, the current slowing as if waiting for something. I watched the line drift downstream, my breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest, the anticipation building with every second. And then, just like before, the rod jerked violently in my hands. The pull was so strong, it nearly yanked me off my feet. I staggered forward, gripping the rod with both hands, my boots sinking into the mud. This wasn't like any fish I'd ever fought. It felt like the river itself had taken hold of the line, dragging me toward the swirling depths. I braced myself, digging my heels into the soft earth as I tried to reel it in, but the force behind the pull was overwhelming. I felt the familiar haze begin to cloud over me, the edges of my vision blurring. My heart raced, and the world around me began to fade away. The roar of the river grew distant, replaced by a deep, low hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The ground beneath me vanished. I was somewhere else. When my vision cleared, I found myself standing at the edge of the same river, but it was different now. The sky above me was dark, bruised with clouds that swirled like ink across a stormy sky. The water was black, darker than it had been before, and the air felt thick with a foreboding sense of dread. I wasn't alone. A young boy stood next to me, his small frame trembling as he gripped the rod in his hands. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, and his eyes were wide with fear. He couldn't have been more than 12 or 13. I wanted to say something, to ask him who he was, what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. I was stuck, an observer trapped in someone else's body once again. The boy was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with quick, panicked breaths. He glanced down at the rod, his fingers trembling as he tried to reel in whatever was on the other end. But the line was taut, and the rod bent under the weight of something massive, something unseen. I could feel it too, the pull. It was the same as before, but stronger this time, more insistent. The river wanted him, just as it had wanted the others. The boy stumbled forward, his feet slipping on the muddy bank, but he didn't let go of the rod. He kept reeling, desperate to pull whatever it was to the surface. His knuckles were white, his hands trembling with the effort. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the air, and the boy's line went slack. The force of it sent him crashing to the ground, the rod slipping from his hands. He looked up, panic flooding his face, as something enormous began to rise from the water. The river churned violently, waves crashing against the shore as a massive shape emerged from the depths. It wasn't a fish, it was something else, something far more terrifying. Its body was long and serpentine, covered in dark, slick scales that glistened in the dim light. Its head was large, with glowing eyes that burned like embers in the night. The boy's breath hitched in his throat as the creature loomed over him, its massive jaws opening wide. He scrambled backward, his hands slipping in the mud, but there was nowhere to go. The creature lunged forward, its maw gaping, ready to swallow him whole. And then, everything stopped. The world froze, the sound of the river fading into silence. The creature hung in the air, suspended in time, its jaws inches from the boy's face. I stood there, watching, unable to move, unable to help. The boy's eyes locked onto mine, filled with a terror I'd never seen before. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went black. When I blinked again, I was back at the riverbank, my hands gripping the rod. The lure hung limp in the water, the line slack, and the river had returned to its normal, steady flow. The air was still cold, but the sense of dread was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. I dropped the rod, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My chest was heaving, my breath ragged. I had just witnessed something awful, something unnatural, and I couldn't get the image of that boy's terrified face out of my mind. I stood there for a long time, staring at the water, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I knew it wasn't over, not yet. The waters had more to show me, more to take. But whatever came next, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. Days passed, but the image of the boy and that monstrous creature from the river stuck with me like a bad dream. I couldn't get his face out of my head, those wide, terrified eyes, the way his hands slipped in the mud as he tried to escape. I hadn't just seen it, I felt it. The helplessness, the fear, the overwhelming realization that the thing pulling on the line wasn't just a fish, it was something far worse. I hadn't been back to the shop since. I didn't need to. The third rod sat in the corner of my living room, untouched since that day at the river. It loomed there like a dark presence, a constant reminder that whatever had started with that first cast wasn't finished yet. I tried to move on. I went back to my usual fishing spots with my old gear, tried to clear my head, but nothing felt right. The waters had changed for me. Every time I cast my line, I half expected to see something unnatural rising from the depths, jaws open, ready to pull me under. I couldn't enjoy fishing anymore, not like I used to. But the real problem wasn't the fear, it was the pull. The same nagging feeling that had led me into that cursed shop was still there, gnawing at me, urging me to pick up the rod and cast it one more time. There was something unfinished, something the waters needed me to see. I had been fighting it for days, trying to ignore the call, but it wasn't working. I knew I had to go back. One last cast. On the day I finally gave in, the weather couldn't have been more perfect for fishing. The sky was clear, the air warm but not too hot, and a soft breeze rustled through the trees outside my window. But none of that mattered. I wasn't headed to a lake or a river this time. No, I was going somewhere much worse. I grabbed the rod, the silver gleam of the reel catching the light as I slung it over my shoulder. This one felt different from the others, heavier, but not just in weight. It felt like it carried something with it, a history I couldn't understand. I got in my truck, my stomach tight with a sense of foreboding. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but the pull of the rod would guide me. It always did. I drove for hours, leaving the familiar roads behind and winding deeper into the countryside. The sky, once so bright and inviting, had darkened as I got further away from town. Heavy clouds rolled in, thick and angry, blotting out the sun. By the time I reached the edge of a large, desolate lake, the air was heavy with the promise of a storm. The lake was massive, its waters dark and choppy, the wind whipping across the surface. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time, surrounded by dense, twisted trees that swayed ominously in the growing wind. There were no boats, no fishermen, no signs of life. Just me and the water. I parked the truck and stepped out, the weight of the rod pulling on my shoulder as I approached the shoreline. The wind howled, sending ripples across the lake that crashed against the rocks at my feet. A storm was brewing, and I knew I didn't have much time before it hit. But the pull was too strong. I had to cast. I tied a lure onto the line, my fingers numb from the cold wind, and flicked the rod forward. The lure sailed through the air, landing in the water with a soft plop, swallowed by the dark waves. I reeled in slowly, the tension in the line growing with each turn of the reel. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, knowing that whatever was coming wouldn't be a normal catch. Then, just as expected, the rod jerked violently in my hands. It was the strongest pull I had ever felt, nearly yanking the rod from my grip. My boots dug into the rocky shore as I braced myself, trying to hold on. The water churned and swirled, waves crashing higher and harder against the shore as if the lake itself was alive, fighting to pull me in. I clenched my jaw, gritting my teeth against the force, my arms burning with the effort. The sky above me darkened even more, heavy clouds swirling in a tight circle overhead. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and a bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the scene for a split second. The air was thick with static, the storm closing in fast. And then, everything changed. The ground beneath my feet vanished. The wind died down. The lake disappeared. I was somewhere else. I blinked, my surroundings blurring into focus. I was on a boat, but not just any boat. This one was old, its wooden deck creaking under my feet as it swayed in the violent storm. The rain poured down in sheets, cold and relentless, soaking me to the bone. Waves crashed against the sides of the boat, and the wind howled like a beast, whipping at the sails. There were others with me, 3 men, all older, their faces lined with the wear and tear of a life spent on the water. They were shouting at each other, their voices lost in the roar of the storm. One of them, the captain by the look of him, was at the helm, struggling to steer the boat through the massive waves. His hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, his eyes wide with fear. I wanted to move, to speak, but I couldn't. I was trapped in someone else's body again, just like before. I was an observer, forced to live through their final moments. Suddenly, a massive wave crashed over the deck, sending water rushing across the planks. The boat groaned under the force, tipping dangerously to one side. The men scrambled, grabbing onto ropes, trying to keep the ship from capsizing. The wind screamed, tearing at the sails, and I could feel the tension in the air growing, like something was about to snap. And then, I saw it. Rising from the water, its massive form breaking through the surface, was something that shouldn't exist. A creature, larger than anything I'd ever seen, its dark, slick-bodied glistening in the rain. It was serpentine, with long, muscular coils that slithered through the water like it owned the storm. Its head was enormous, with glowing, yellow eyes that pierced through the darkness. Jaws lined with sharp, jagged teeth opened wide as it let out a deafening roar, shaking the entire boat. One of the men screamed, his voice lost in the chaos as the creature lunged forward, wrapping its massive coils around the boat. The wood creaked and groaned under the pressure, the entire vessel shaking as if it were about to be torn apart. I wanted to run, to do something, anything, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what was happening. The creature squeezed tighter, and the boat splintered beneath us, the deck cracking open like a broken rib cage. The storm raged on, the rain pouring down harder, the wind howling louder. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, no, not mine. Whoever I was living through. I felt the terror clawing at my throat, the knowledge that this was it. This was how it ended. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the shore, the storm above me still rumbling, the wind still howling. The rod was in my hands, the line slack, the lure floating lifeless in the churning water. I dropped the rod, stumbling backward, my chest heaving with breathless panic. I had just witnessed something beyond anything I could explain, something that defied reason, logic, and nature. The men on that boat, had they been real? Had they suffered the same fate as the boy by the river? And what was that thing? That monster? I turned and ran back to my truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The storm was closing in, and I wasn't sticking around to see what came next. But as I sped away from the lake, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The waters had more to show me. I didn't sleep for days after what happened at the lake. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature again, its massive body rising from the water, jaws gaping wide, ready to crush the boat like it was made of paper. I could still feel the rain pelting my skin, the wind howling in my ears, and the crack of wood as the ship was torn apart. It haunted me, sitting in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. But there was something else now. It wasn't just fear keeping me up at night, it was a sense of inevitability. Whatever had started with that first cast, whatever the waters had shown me, wasn't finished. Each vision had been more intense, more vivid, pulling me deeper into the stories of people I didn't know but could feel. I wasn't just witnessing their deaths, I was living them. I tried to block it out, to push it all away. But the pull, the same one that had led me to the old man's shop in the first place, was stronger than ever. It gnawed at me constantly, dragging my thoughts back to the rods, the visions, the waters. And I knew, deep down, that there was still one more cast left. One last piece of the puzzle. The storm had left the lake behind, but in its wake, the air felt different, heavier. The skies were mostly clear now, but it was like the atmosphere had been permanently charged with some kind of unseen energy, and I could feel it everywhere I went. At work, at home, in the grocery store, none of it felt real anymore. Everything felt like a thin layer of normalcy stretched over something dark and waiting. It wasn't long before I found myself back in my truck, the third rod resting on the passenger seat next to me, still gleaming with that unnerving silver shine. I didn't have a destination this time. I just drove, letting the pull guide me like it had before. Hours passed, the landscape outside the window growing more remote, the roads turning from pavement to gravel, then finally dirt. The trees grew thicker, older, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And then, at the end of the road, I saw it, an old, abandoned bridge stretching over a river that snaked its way through the woods. The bridge was rusted and weathered, its steel beams twisted and bent like it hadn't seen use in decades. The river below was slow and murky, its surface barely moving, but I knew better. Beneath that calm surface, something was waiting. I parked the truck and stepped out, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft trickle of the river and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The bridge groaned under my weight as I walked across it, the old steel creaking with every step. I made my way to the center, where the river was at its deepest. There was no hesitation this time. I tied a lure onto the line, the cold metal of the reel feeling heavier in my hands than before, and cast the line into the water below. The lure hit the surface with a soft splash, rippling the calm water, and then, silence. I stood there, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, the familiar tension building as I gripped the rod tighter. The air around me felt electric, like the world was holding its breath. But this time, the pull didn't come. Minutes passed. The line drifted lazily in the water, but nothing happened. No sudden tug, no violent jerk. Just stillness. And then, I heard it. A whisper. At first, it was so faint I thought I'd imagined it, just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from the water. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, soft, and filled with something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a voice. It was voices. Plural. Multiple whispers, all overlapping, all speaking at once, like a chorus of the dead murmuring from below. I backed up a step, my grip tightening on the rod as my heart raced. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still I couldn't understand them. It was like they were speaking in a language I didn't know, or maybe didn't want to know. My instinct screamed at me to drop the rod, to turn and run back to the truck, to get away from the river, from the bridge, from the whispers. But I couldn't move. Something held me there, frozen in place, as the whispers seemed to rise from the depths of the water. They swirled around me, filling the air, creeping into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like tendrils of mist. It felt like they were trying to tell me something, trying to pull me into their world, into the dark waters beneath the surface. And then, without warning, the rod jerked. The force was so sudden, so violent, that it ripped the rod from my hands before I could react. It flew forward, yanked over the edge of the bridge, and disappeared into the river with a loud splash. The whispers stopped instantly. The air was thick with silence. I stood there, stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. Whatever had been down there, whatever had grabbed the line, it was gone. The rod was gone. Everything was gone. But the whispers, they stayed with me. I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me, and stumbled toward the truck. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. I couldn't take another second of that place, of those voices. My hands fumbled with the keys as I climbed into the truck, slamming the door behind me. The engine roared to life, and I peeled away from the bridge, kicking up dirt as I sped down the road. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, the familiar streets and lights of civilization a welcome sight after the nightmare I'd just endured. But even as I pulled into my driveway, my heart still pounding in my chest, the whispers echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake them. And as I sat there in the truck, staring out at the quiet street, I realized something that chilled me to my core. The rod was gone. But the pull wasn't. The whispers haunted me long after I left that old bridge behind. They followed me home, creeping into the silence of my house like a shadow I couldn't shake. At night, they filled my dreams, murmuring things I couldn't understand, their voices thick with meaning that I wasn't ready to face. And during the day, they lingered at the edge of my thoughts, faint but constant, like the echo of something forgotten but not gone. The rod was gone. Dragged under by something that lived in the dark depths of that river. And yet, the pull hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. There was something unfinished, something the waters still needed from me. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, no matter how much I wanted to walk away, I knew it was only a matter of time before I went back. Days passed in a blur. I tried to distract myself, tried to focus on anything but the whispers. I went to work, stocked shelves, smiled at customers like everything was normal. But every time I was alone, whether it was driving home in the truck or sitting in my living room, the feeling returned, gnawing at me, demanding that I do something. The whispers, the visions, the pull, they were all leading me somewhere. And I knew exactly where. That damn shop. I hadn't been back since the last time I walked out with the third rod. The old man's words had echoed in my head for weeks now, filling in the silences left by the whispers. You're not just seeing their deaths, you're feeling their burdens. You'll know when you get there. Well, I'd gotten there. I'd lived their deaths, felt their burdens, and now I was supposed to just walk away? No. The waters had more to show me, and whether I liked it or not, the only place I could find the answers was back at that shop. So, one gray morning, I got into my truck and drove straight there. The streets were damp from an early morning rain, and the sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened more. It felt appropriate, like the world was setting the stage for what was coming. As I pulled up outside the shop, I felt a sense of dread settle in my chest. The sign above the door, Hooks, was still there, faded and worn, the tagline beneath it barely readable now, fish in their waters. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the shop, wondering if the old man would even be there this time. But I didn't have a choice. I had to know. The pull was stronger than ever, and it was guiding me here for a reason. I pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of the bell ringing through the air as I stepped inside. The shop looked exactly as it had before, rows of fishing rods, nets hanging from the ceiling, shelves cluttered with gear that had seen better days. The smell of leather and saltwater still clung to the air, thick and comforting in a way that made me uneasy. And there he was. The old man. Sitting behind the counter, just like the first time I'd walked in, his weathered hands busy tying another fishing knot. He looked up as I approached, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. Back again, huh, he said, his voice as rough as ever. Didn't think you'd be able to stay away. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. The rod, it's gone. His eyes gleamed with something I couldn't quite place. Dragged under, was it? I nodded. Something took it. In the river. The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. That's how it always goes. You cast your line into their waters long enough, and eventually, the waters take what's theirs. What do you mean? I asked, the frustration bubbling up inside me. What is all this? The visions, the whispers, what the hell is happening to me? The old man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter, his gaze locking onto mine. You've seen the others' lives. Felt their last moments. Their burdens became yours the moment you picked up those rods. He paused, his voice dropping lower. But this isn't just about them. It's about you. I stared at him, confusion swirling with the fear in my chest. What do you mean, me? You've been drawn to the waters for a reason, he continued. You didn't just stumble in here by accident. The waters have been calling you for a long time. Each rod you've used, each life you've seen, it's all been leading you here. To this moment. The weight of his words pressed down on me like a stone. I wanted to argue, to deny it, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. There had always been something pulling me toward the water, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just about curiosity. It was something deeper. Something I didn't want to face. So what now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What's left? The old man's smile faded, replaced by a solemn expression. There's one more cast, son. One last line to throw. My stomach twisted. But the rod's gone. I don't have anything left. He stood up slowly, moving around the counter toward a dusty corner of the shop I hadn't noticed before. There, leaning against the wall, was a single rod. It was unlike any of the others, black as night, sleek, with an intricate design carved into the handle. It looked older, worn, but with an undeniable power to it. The old man picked it up and brought it over, holding it out to me. This is the last one. The final cast. I hesitated, staring at the rod. Everything inside me screamed to walk away, to leave and never look back. But the pull, it was stronger than it had ever been. It wasn't just whispering anymore, it was demanding. I reached out slowly, my fingers closing around the cold, black handle. The moment I touched it, the whispers flooded my mind. They weren't faint now, they were loud, clear, filling every corner of my thoughts. And this time, I understood. They're waiting for you, the old man said, his voice barely audible over the roar in my head. The waters have shown you everything. Now, it's time for you to meet them. I staggered back, the weight of the rod pulling me down. The whispers were louder now, voices overlapping, calling me to the water, urging me to make the final cast. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembling as I gripped the rod tighter. The old man smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite name. You've come this far. You already know how it ends. Without another word, I turned and left the shop, the rod heavy in my hands, the whispers echoing in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. The waters were calling. And I had no choice but to answer. The road stretched endlessly before me, but I wasn't steering anymore, not really. The pull of the waters was guiding me, stronger than it had ever been, and I had no choice but to follow. The rod, the final rod, sat on the passenger seat, its black surface gleaming dully in the pale light of the overcast sky. I could feel it humming with energy, vibrating softly, as if it knew that the end was near. The whispers were constant now. They filled my head with a low, murmuring chorus that I couldn't escape. They weren't just voices anymore, they were calling to me, summoning me to the waters, demanding that I finish what I had started. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no turning back. The road grew narrower as I drove deeper into the woods. The trees closed in on either side, their gnarled branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the sky. The world felt smaller, darker, like I was entering a place that didn't exist on any map. A place that had been waiting for me all along. And then, at the end of the road, I saw it. A lake, vast and black, stretching out into the distance. Its surface was unnaturally still, like glass, reflecting the dark clouds above. There were no birds, no animals, no sound except for the whispers in my mind. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of the water and whatever lurked beneath it. I parked the truck and stepped out, the rod in my hand, feeling the cold earth beneath my boots. The shore was barren, no rocks, no plants, just a strip of muddy ground leading down to the water's edge. The lake itself was unlike any I'd seen before. There was something wrong with it. Something ancient, something hungry. I walked slowly toward the shore, the whispers growing louder with every step. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, my chest tight with anticipation and fear. The pull was overwhelming now, dragging me forward, urging me to cast the line one last time. When I reached the water's edge, I hesitated. My reflection stared back at me from the still surface, pale and hollow-eyed. The rod felt heavy in my hands, the black metal cold against my skin. The whispers swirled in my head, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices demanding that I finish it. I tied the lure onto the line with trembling hands, my fingers numb from the cold, and cast the line into the water. The lure hit the surface with a soft plop, sending ripples out across the lake, breaking the perfect stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. The lake remained calm, the line drifting lazily in the water. But then, I felt it. The familiar, terrifying pull. It started as a soft tug, then quickly grew into something far more powerful. The rod jerked violently in my hands, the line going taut, stretching out into the black depths of the lake. Whatever was down there, it was massive, stronger than anything I'd ever felt before. My arms burned with the effort of holding on as the pull grew stronger, the rod bending under the strain. The lake churned, the water bubbling and swirling as if something huge was moving beneath the surface. My heart pounded in my chest, fear gripping me as I struggled to reel in whatever had taken the bait. The whispers were deafening now, filling my mind with a single, overwhelming message: this is it. This is the end. And then, the world shifted. The ground beneath me disappeared, and once again, I was somewhere else. I was underwater. I could feel the cold pressure of the lake surrounding me, the crushing weight of the water pressing in on all sides. I tried to breathe, but my lungs burned, my body screaming for air. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the water, filling my head with their relentless chorus. In the darkness, I saw them. The others. They floated around me, their faces pale and distorted by the water. I recognized them, each of them. The boy from the river, the fisherman from the boat, the men from the storm. They were all here, suspended in the murky depths, their eyes wide with the same fear I felt now. Their mouths moved, whispering the same words that echoed in my mind, but I couldn't understand them. All I could feel was their pain, their helplessness. And then I saw it. Rising from the darkness, its massive body coiled and twisted, the same creature I had seen in the visions before. Its glowing eyes burned through the water, locking onto me as it moved closer, its jaws wide, ready to devour. But this time, I didn't run. I didn't fight. I understood now. The pull had brought me here, not just to witness, but to join them. The whispers grew louder, clearer, and I finally understood their words: you are one of us now. The creature lunged, its jaws closing around me, and everything went black. I woke up on the shore of the lake, the rod lying beside me in the mud. The water was still again, calm and silent, as if nothing had happened. The sky above was dark, heavy with clouds, but there was no storm. No wind. No sound. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my mind foggy with the weight of what had just happened. The whispers were gone, but the pull, it was still there, deep inside me. I knew now that it would never leave. I had become a part of the waters, just like the others. I picked up the rod, feeling its weight in my hands one last time. It was cold, lifeless, like all the energy had drained from it. The final cast had been made. As I stood up, I glanced back at the lake, its black surface reflecting the sky. I knew what I had to do. I walked toward the truck, my mind strangely calm, the fear replaced by a quiet understanding. The waters had shown me everything. Their stories, their lives, their deaths. And now I was one of them. I drove away from the lake, leaving the rod behind, knowing that the pull would always be with me. But I wouldn't return. Not this time. Because now, I understood.